Next, we have Kunal, who will be introducing our next speaker, Professor Christine Loh.
Kunal again. Again, PhD candidate from QUT. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Christine Loh. Professor Loh is Chief Development Strategist at the Institute for the Environment at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Thank you, Professor Loh.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I turned on right from the beginning because I learned a lot from everybody. And in some ways, I don't want to just talk about some prepared statement, about sustainability. But I think it'd be more appropriate at this stage to really maybe highlight some of the things that you've said that maybe we haven't added to the conversation yet. Technology obviously is very important to defeating climate change and biodiversity loss and so on. But perhaps let me just pick up on a few issues. The ChatGPT, this is a big issue at universities and schools right now. And I just want to say that the people who trained the programs, we're also having this conversation right now in English. If we were to switch to our home countries and have a discussion in our home language, and what we have in terms of our local language in ChatGPT, the answers might be quite different. In a way, we feel we're a part of a global company, a community, when we're educated in English and when we're speaking in English. We adopt UN, the narratives of sustainable development and so on. I just want to say that there is a cultural and political bent behind all of this. And I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying this is something we should be aware of, that we're using a standard global language in a certain narrative. The reason I want to go into this is in different countries, governments have chosen different things to do, and they're not going to happen maybe elsewhere. So, for example, in China, the government has proposed young children should be restricted on the number of hours they spend on their mobile devices. Now, I don't know whether anybody else around the world is going to do that, but that's based on how people feel about the impact of the mobile devices on young people. Now, there is an ethical aspect to it as well, but it's not so easy to sort of say, well, what do we do about it? Do we restrict people on it? We've been talking about the data itself, what kind of circumstances. This notion of just restricting people, particularly young people, on certain things, we could see that as quite extreme, but that is happening. So I don't know what the solution is. I'm just saying this is happening in the world. The second thing, of course, is, and other people have talked about it, in the global south, when the technology became available, the leapfrog phenomenon is very fast and very real. This is going to keep happening. And in this kind of situation, it is difficult for governments and developers to think about how to kind of restrain it and hold it back. But it's going to be a continuous challenge for all of us. The other issue that I want to talk about is the market. And the fact is, if you run a digital service company, you want people to stay on your program for as long as possible. That's the financial business model. And you have one of the researchers talking about, well, what happened when you have some kind of a disaster? You really want the service to be free. So the question is, how does one fund what kind of programs? And when we talk about technology, I think there are two two essential groups of things that people have to pay for. One is hardware. It's all very well to talk about the digital world, but if you don't have the equipment, you don't have the mobile phone, you don't have the stations and so on that are all there to give you this reliable service that everybody wants, then you ain't going to be able to have it very efficiently. So question again, in the global south, these things, at least the basic equipment, are quite standardized now. I mean, you can say these things are made and they could be distributed at a reasonable price. So how can we make sure that the global south has access at a reasonable cost to the equipment itself? And then, of course, the other bit is the data, what you do with it and so on, and how money is made. So I just want to say and end with an idea, how one funds the non-profit part. In some countries, for example, in India, the government has mandated that listed companies have to put aside a certain sum of money that has to be given to the government. And this is one way of getting a sum of money through redistribution. It is a kind of tax, but it's not taxed on your profit. This is taxed, I think this is a pre-profit tax. So what I'm saying, I'm not suggesting that everybody ought to do that. And even when you collect money like that, who decides where to then apply it? So can we have a very different mindset to really talk about money, the financing side of the hardware and the software, and where you apply and when and where you can apply services, because you need it immediately, and they cannot, people can't sort of say, well, I can't pay for it. Is it a good idea to have sums of money that are put aside for dealing with disasters? And the kind of disasters, we talked about earthquake, but today, extreme weather is going to be more and more frequent in many, many parts of the world. And it's especially difficult for emerging economies where an extreme event could be highly, highly destructive. So I think it's also important for us to think about the application of what type of digital technology that we need to prepare for, so that when we have a natural disaster event, that certain things will be rolled out. What are those that the government will support? What are those that companies that are, for example, providing electricity and water and so on, the basic stuff, what it is that they have to fund? Because as you can imagine, let's say you have a disaster, there's no electricity, you have no digital services at all. So perhaps what I'm trying to say here is, let's look at different types of situations and talk about maybe the easier bit of how to provide basic services when there are collective disasters that need to be dealt with. So let me stop here, and thank you very much for including me.
Christine, thank you. And the floor is open for questions. Your points were very, very relevant to our experience here at Gaia, having started during the pandemic, and then our students, as Iris's presentation pointed out. Are there any questions for Christine?
Excuse me, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. And I have a question. If you have a regulation in order to restrict screen time for children, for example, how do you monitor this?
That's a very good question. It's all going to have to be done with the service providers. So in a way, this is the phone of a person of a certain age. I mean, of course, there are probably many ways to get around it. And it's also a family experience, right? Because the child will not be able to buy his or her own phone. The phone will be provided by the parent. But the illustration I wanted to make is, well, that's a rather extreme case, but quite popular with parents.
Okay.
Yes, Kunal. I see people with their hand up. Please, please. Whom shall I? Well, I'm kind of looking. Is it Martin who has his hand up right now?
Martin?
Please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Martin. I'm based here at Strathmore University. I liked the recommendation you made on the tail end about being able to tax companies or at least put a fee to companies. Assuming you could give a very practical policy recommendation at the level of the UN, what could that be? Is it embed that within the UN global?
I suspect it will be very difficult because in some jurisdictions, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I just lost my connection.
Which is why I'm having problems hearing, sorry.
Sorry, I just had a loss of connection. And then secondly, if you could make a recommendation to the legislature in national government, very practical, what could that be? Thank you.
Well, I think first of all, I invite each one of you to look at what is the culture of your society and your legislature. There are some around the world where very, very hard to propose anything that is a new tax. So the example from India is quite unique to India. But the idea that I try to propose is, in the digital age, is there an argument for certain types of cases, like in a natural disaster, where certain services cannot fail, they need to continue? How do you make sure that that happens? So one group of services will be, electricity. Another one are the kind of startups that one of your colleagues are saying, we've invented these apps, we could be helping people. How do we fund this? Is it that you develop an app and it is fully funded only during certain times? Now, whether that helps you survive or not, I don't know. But I'm looking at the essentiality of certain needs under certain circumstances and how that could be funded. And the broad idea is, could it be sort of publicly funded? Publicly could mean the government would fund it, or the government would extract through, some way, maybe the digital industry, to actually set a sum of money aside up to perhaps a certain limit in a year, where that sum will be used for specific purposes. So I would invite each one of you to think about what might be acceptable in your jurisdiction, because something that is acceptable in India might not be acceptable in the United States, and might not be acceptable in let's say, Kenya.